Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Peter D. Jacobson, co-author of Combating Teen Smoking, Research and Policy Strategies. Welcome to Rip Rap, Peter.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
This is kind of an unusual book. We were just talking now, just before we went on the air here, there's a blurb on there that says this is a compendium,
Right.
and that evokes sometimes expectations of sort of a positivist thing, survey or exploration of the literature. But this really is an example where you pretty seriously set out a foundation of the literature to then go into exploring the strategies about teen smoking.
What we tried to do is to collect the information and synthesize it. What do we know, what don't we know? But use that as a point of departure so that someone could pick up the book and use it. Not just say, oh, this is what's happened over time, but how do we use it to change the social context of teen smoking? How do we use it to discourage kids from smoking? Our initial vision of this was very much a book that would be accessible to people, to family members, to communities, so that they could use it and change how they go about addressing the problem of teen smoking.
Well, we should mention that you're one of several authors that worked on this book, but there was a strategic purpose to each author's contribution.
Each author has a very specific expertise, from my more general social science and law background to two health economists, Ken Warner and Jeffrey Wasserman. Paula Lantz is an expert social scientist with a background in epidemiology, and Alexis Ostrom and Harold Pollack Harold has a background in policy analysis, and Alexis Ostrom, the final author, was a student whom we hired to do a lot of the background research.
Pull it all together.
But then we pulled it all together, and I think what you get is, instead of a focus on any one aspect of the problem, we have multidisciplinary a multidisciplinary focus, so that you end up with a much broader look at the problem than you would if you only looked at the economics of it, for example. Economics is an important aspect of it, raising the prices, but it's only one aspect. You have to look at the regulatory aspects and also at how the culture of smoking emerges. How does it affect teen behavior?
Well, one of the things that fascinates me about the book is this idea of what can scholars do when the research indicates that a catastrophic crisis they're examining is preventable.
It's an interesting question and observation, because there's always a pull, a tug and a pull in scholarship between academic rigor, theoretical rigor, and policy relevance. What we decided was that we would make this effective scholarship so that academics would be happy with it, but really use that scholarship in a way to make the problem accessible to people who can use it, people who can change policy. We want a state legislator, a state health department official, local health department official, a tobacco control coalition member, all to be able to pick up that book and use it, get something out of it to change policy. We're not interested in developing new theoretical measurement of disease prevention. Quite the contrary. What we want to do is translate academic theory and scholarship for the end user, the person who can change policy.
Well, and that's what fascinates me, is that whole idea of the intellectual in the public space and public discourse.
Yeah, I think it's very important for scholars, for intellectuals, to translate what they do to the public. If they don't, you have this sterile debate among academicians that only they can read. That's fine on one level, but my feeling has been from the beginning that if you don't reach the policymaker, if you don't orient your work toward changing policy, it's really not effective. It it's not even effective in the classroom because most students can't follow the extreme theorizing. So we really tried to say, how do you bridge the gap between scholarship, rigorous scholarship, and effective policymaking?
Well, and as you point out, you and the other authors point out, there's more than 400,000 Americans who die prematurely because of tobacco use.
This is a serious problem. Pardon me. It's a problem that has engaged scholars and policymakers for several decades. In part, sort of spinning wheels, but in part you see real change over the last 20 years. What we're trying to do is say, how can you accelerate that change? How can we contribute to a changing environment? And so it's not just trying to rethink how we go about it, but to take that and apply it.
Well, as you point out in the book, you call this policy-oriented research agenda, and
It is.
It's quite interesting.
Very much trying to change how we think about it. If you're a state legislator and you have X dollars to spend, what we want to do is show you that in fact you can spend some money on tobacco control in a way that is effective and that will reduce the state's tobacco-related disease costs in the long run. And so I think one barrier to how academic scholarship has been used in the past has been a sense among policymakers that nothing they do will really make a difference. Not a nihilism, in a sense, but a very hard-nosed, what can you do for me? And I think it's saying you can, by taking at least some of what we've described and thought about, develop that into a comprehensive program that can reduce teen smoking.
Well, and as you point out also in the book, there's 45 million Americans who smoke, and most of them began in their teen years.
There's some interesting developments on the data. Up until recently, if you took any survey of data trends, you would find that pretty close to 90% of smokers started before age 18. So the feeling has been, if you capture that audience through prevention or even cessation and stop them from smoking or initiating, in particular beyond age 18, you would really reduce the amount of adult smoking fairly rapidly over the next couple of generations. What's happened recently, though, is a couple of things. More and more 18 to 24-year-old people, what we call the young adults, are initiating smoking. So what does that mean for what we thought about the problem? The other thing is that you see the age of onset becoming younger and younger. So at one point it was 14, now it's close to 12. What does that mean? For one thing, it means that these kids that start smoking at age 11, 12 will be smoking longer. For another, it means that they're likely to get addicted much more quickly because they have smaller systems. And we don't know all about the genetics of addiction, but it means we have to pay much more attention to teen cessation, and we have to rethink our strategy of focusing on teens. We have to look at this young adult population and ask, why are they smoking? Has it been that we've been effective in stopping kids from smoking? Or are the pressures of being in college, that age, now much greater than they were a generation or two ago? One other thing about the data trends that I think is interesting. If you compare tobacco to alcohol use among kids, drug use among kids over the last 20 to 25 years, you see something very interesting. Alcohol use has declined among youth. Drug use has declined among youth. Tobacco use has stayed almost constant. Why is that? Why are kids shifting? Poor choice of words. Why are kids drinking and consuming illicit substances, drugs, at a much lower rate now, but maintain that line on cigarettes. Honestly, I don't think we really know the answer to that, but that's one contribution research will have to make over the next few years.
Is it something where the kids are mimicking patterns that they see in the culture and they're reinforced in cinema and television?
Yes, that's an important cause of teen smoking. Most of the literature focuses on peer influences and parental influences. What I think is going on is that among younger teens 11 to 14, 15, the parental influence is stronger. But as parents of kids know, the older they get, the less control you have over them, and then the peer influence kicks in. So if they're in a group of peers with a lot of smokers, that matters. The overall culture matters. And one of the things that we focus on in this book is how do you change the culture? How do you make smoking increasingly unacceptable in society so that kids have a harder time or discouraged from smoking? And if they do, they have to do it furtively. So we're looking at a couple of things. One, how do we get family members involved? How do we get parents to say, even if they smoke, they should say no smoking in the home. They should try to quit. Bring in physicians. Family physicians can play a very important role here in getting the whole family to focus on it. Suppose, for example, you smoke and you have an 11-year-old in your home. The message you're sending is very clear. It's all right to smoke, no matter what you say. So if you can engage in a smoking cessation program, you can send a strong message to your child. If you can say no smoking in the home, you send an equivalent message to your child. If we enact laws prohibiting smoking in public places, we send a community-wide message to young people that smoking is a bad habit. It has very harmful connotations for morbidity and mortality that are well known. And then you pull this all together in a comprehensive program and you start to change the culture. And that's what I think needs to be done.
Well, as you were talking, I was wondering, is there a possibility that what in the book you call environmental smoke or others call secondhand smoke, could that cause someone who's subjected to that day after day to start getting addicted to the cigarette smoke?
It's an interesting question. I don't think so. But it may well encourage a propensity to smoke. It may reduce sort of the resistance that a young person might have to it. But I don't think there's any evidence showing that there's much of an addiction to secondhand smoke.
It's just seeing mom and dad.
It's just seeing. It's both seeing and the nonverbal message that's sent, that it's acceptable. If mom and dad do it, it must be okay. The other thing we have to keep in mind, and it's easy to get lost, is it's a rebellious age. And one way kids rebel is through this kind of deviant behavior. Particularly if you're trying to stop it, teens tend to want to do the opposite. But I think over time, if we send the message that there really are long-term consequences to it that are very adverse to your health, that are known, and hammer that message. One of the things we argue for is what we call an anti-smoking media campaign based on social marketing principles. And what that means simply is an attempt to use the very imagery that the tobacco industry uses to market their products against them, to show the kids that they're actually being manipulated by the tobacco industry, and that the tobacco industry is quite happy to sell this image of glamour, as you put it before, have their product placed in the movies and show that the stars smoke. And the more we show what happens to someone who smokes, the more we show that you're simply being, again, manipulated by the industry, the better chance we have of, discouraging kids from smoking.
Well, one of the interesting things you had in your book is that the use of tobacco in the Americas dates back to the 9th century. Um, and I thought that was interesting
Yeah.
because that helps set the
Yeah.
context for
Yeah.
what's going on now.
I think what's important to think about in those terms is that you're never going to get to zero tolerance. And I think tobacco control advocates need to be realistic here. There's a certain level below which you're never going to go. Doesn't mean we can't isolate it. Doesn't mean we can't make it difficult. We can raise the price. We can enact laws that restrict smoking in public places, we were talking about before. But you're always going to have a certain percentage of the population that smokes. Our goal has to be to reduce that number, reduce the number who start, to provide smoking cessation programs for those who do smoke, and to reduce the overall health care burden on those who do smoke. So I think we have some long-term objectives that really don't depend on zero tolerance. Let me give you a couple of specific examples of what communities can do. One of the things we discovered in reviewing one other point as a digression. You mentioned it started in the 9th century. In some cultures, smoking tobacco has been rewarded with a death sentence, and it didn't stop smoking there. So if capital punishment isn't a deterrent,
Kill them off before they
kill
get
them off
killed
before they get there. That's one. That also helps to control population growth. So we can segue into that. But to get back to the point I was going to make, was one of the things we discovered here was if you can use teens effectively to convey the message to other teens. There are the pop crowd, the sports heroes, all of these, the leaders in high schools, including, by the way, ex-smokers. Let them go in and speak to their younger cohorts, their younger teens and peers, to say why they quit, to say it's not good because of X, Y, or Z. Much better in the long run, I think, than having an adult come in. Yeah, I can rattle off and I can the statistics and I can talk about it, but I'm an adult. And at this age, adults are not who these kids want to hear from. They'd rather hear from their peers. So the more we can involve older peers, I think the better we are, better off we are in discouraging younger kids from smoking.
Well, it's certainly a deeply embedded issue in our culture, it seems.
It is. And that's changing somewhat, though what's interesting about that, I think, is even within the last 10 years, the ups and downs of it. If you look at teen smoking trends in, let's say, from the mid-1980s to now, and also cultural trends, you see a couple of things. One is a fairly steep decline in the late 80s in teen smoking initiation rates, with a substantial uptake into the early and mid-90s, and then now we're dropping back. At the same time, we had lots of product placement in movies, lots of glorification of it in the early 90s, but then by the mid-90s you start to see more and more pressure, more laws prohibiting smoking in public places, more laws restricting youth access, price increases, tobacco demonized. And that, I think, is one of the interesting stories of the last 10 to 15 years, how the industry has come to be such a vilified cultural force in the United States. The disclosure of industry documents showing that they lied to the public, the lineup in Congress when one after another of the tobacco industry executives stood up, swore under oath that his product was not addictive, were major, major events changing the industry's perception among the public, changing juror attitudes in litigation, and I think destroying any vestige of the industry's credibility. They simply have no credibility as an industry.
Well, as you said earlier, one of your interests is litigation. And
Yeah.
that certainly has come to be a factor
Yes.
in this whole issue.
Yes. We don't get into that a lot in this book, although one of my co-authors, Ken Warner, and I have written a separate article on the role of litigation in forming and shaping public health policy. What we conclude in there is that we actually antagonize both sides. One side of the debate says litigation will force the industry into bankruptcy and change public health policy. Another side says that's simply inappropriate. Litigation isn't designed to do that. What we argue is sort of a middle ground, saying that indirectly litigation can shape the public policy agenda. But directly, litigation really can't implement the kinds of public health and legislative strategies that have to be done by the Congress or the state legislators and then implemented by the regulators. But litigation is an important aspect of it here, no more important than the disclosure of industry documents.
Well, there's two things I observe about litigation, though. One is that it keeps pressure on the people providing the tobacco that this is an important issue and it's important enough for the courts to consider the issue. And the other one is that while the cases may not be won, it keeps it in front of the public also of the seriousness of the use of tobacco on people's lives. That, you know, they talk about the people who've been using, the effect on people who've been using tobacco for 20 and 30 years,
Right.
and it's catastrophic.
Both of those are true. At the same time, I would caution you in drawing conclusions of the effectiveness of litigation, in part because juror attitudes can change. Jurors can revert to their prior attitude of, you're responsible. You knew what harms could come from cancer. I grew up, for example, in the 50s and 60s. Long before you had warning labels, or not that long before the Surgeon General's report, but my friends who tried smoking, even then, spoke of them as cancer sticks. We knew. Now, we were from an educated community, and that may have made a difference, but we knew. We knew in the 50s. I never smoked, but my father did. And one reason I didn't smoke was he would get up every morning and hack his brains out. I wasn't real smart. I must admit, I wasn't that bright. But I could figure out that this was not a great way to wake up every day. One day, he was in his mid-50s, went to the doctor. Doctor said, if you don't quit, you're going to die. He quit cold the next day. Lived until he was 86. So at least he got some years beyond what he might have otherwise gotten. Anyway, back to the point. Litigation, if jurors start saying again, you're responsible, don't blame the industry for what you've done, then I'm not sure what kind of progress we've made. But I think you're right. The litigation has helped to change the agenda. People in this country are fascinated by litigation. Look at all the stories on TV, the practice, LA law before that, dealing with law. It's dramatic. It galvanizes our attention. So to that extent, I think you're absolutely right.
One thing I thought was interesting is the book points out variables of ethnic and racial differences in the data on youth smoking.
Interesting, isn't it? What you see is that African Americans smoke at much lower rates, both adults and kids. Interestingly, though, the adult rate among African Americans is far higher than the adolescent rate would suggest. So it does suggest that at least in that population, there is a delayed onset of smoking. I don't think we know why that is. One reason for lower rates of smoking in African American communities is some rebellion against the tobacco industry. Don't come into our community.
Before we end the interview, though, there's a little story behind the picture on,
Yes,
on the cover.
there is.
And we should mention that.
Sure. My colleague, co-author Ken Warner, had a picture, wonderful picture, of a little boy, about 11, 12, in front of this beautiful mirror with his father's shirt and tie on, holding a cigarette into the mirror. We couldn't find copyright on it. We couldn't locate who took the picture. So we couldn't use it. The University of Michigan Press, quite rightly, wouldn't use that picture. So we staged this picture with my daughter. Originally, she didn't want to do it. She's a confirmed non-smoker who and wanted to pose without a cigarette, and I said, no, it won't work that way. So finally, I convinced her by saying that here's why I'd like you to do this, because by doing it and being on this book, which is designed to discourage teen smoking, you'll be sending a powerful message to your peers not to smoke, that it's not glamorous, it's not a good idea. And she agreed on that basis, and with the stipulation that we had a disclaimer on the back of the book, and it says, Hannah Jacobson is a confirmed non-smoker, but agreed to pose for this picture to discourage her friends and peers from smoking.
Now, where did she pick up that, that conscious contractual agreement?
I think her father had something to do with that. Yeah.
I noticed that, and I thought
Yeah.
it was delightful.
It is, and she's rather proud of it now, and I'm very proud of her for having done it.
Set out her
Absolutely.
requests
And
stipulations.
yeah, and we worked it out, and she was able to star on her own book cover. And I got the picture I wanted on the cover. And I think my secretary took the picture with a digital camera, but I think the press did a very nice job.
Well, your book points out what can be done by the government, by society, and interested citizens and scientists.
Yeah, and it is all of us. I'm glad you framed it that way, because we really tried to go out of our way to say, you citizens, you can't just rely on government. Government, you can't rely on the market. Everyone has to help change the climate. And I think actually that really my preferred strategy would be for the tobacco control community by community, to take control, take ownership of the issue.
Thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.